For the seminar, the presentation, I thought I'd explore the concept of national sound in jazz and ways in which European jazz practices previously been understood as a vehicle for asserting national identity. And for the next hour or so, I want to introduce some concepts, play some music, and reflect on the different ways in which jazz practice is conceived today. And as John says, I'm the project leader for Rhythm Changes, which is a 3-year project funded by the Humanities and the European Research Area. And I'm interested in the way in which jazz cultures are changing, the way in which musicians relate to the music that they create and to each other, and how established conceptions of jazz can be questioned and interrogated. So the project itself involves a team of 13 researchers working in 7 different institutions across 5 countries in Europe. And activities within the project range from everything from performance projects to education workshops, research publications, and public events. And we're also working with national jazz agencies themselves, other European networks, festivals and venues to explore the cultural impact of jazz and how the music makes people relate to issues of place, of history and nation. So these are sort of broad overarching themes. So there's been a long and complex history of jazz criticism, I suppose, in Europe. And despite the centrality to the creation of a body of writings on jazz, historical writings emanating from Europe are largely described as being overly romanticised and limited in their representation of jazz. And whether it's through a sort of fetishistic desire for otherness, treating African American culture as exotic, or through the ideology of European modernism, creating the feeling that Europeans have corrupted jazz with a different set of ideals or aesthetics, or through a sort of primitivistic accounts of the musicians themselves. And consider, for example, the way in which French writers described the work of Louis Armstrong as a sort of type of noble savage, for example. So, writings such as these are often considered problematic today. Moreover, writings that have discussed the critical relationship between Europe and America have until recently tended to reinforce the sort of journalistic codes, established mythologies, and these straightforward binary oppositions between the 2 continents, and the interplay between musicians working in these different contexts. So typically, European writings are discussed as important historically, but of little use today. Or downplayed as being irrelevant to the spread of the authentic jazz culture in the US. I'm thinking here about James Lincoln Collier, whose reception of jazz in America, for example, arguably commented more on Europe than it did on the reception of jazz in America. Collier devoted the bulk of his text to refuting or downplaying the role that European writers had had in discovering jazz and challenging the idea that Americans did not appreciate jazz as an indigenous art form. So more recently, the formation of an authoritative jazz canon has served to reify jazz in many respects, detaching the music from popular culture and the broad social and geographical exchanges that have taken place. In addition, the neo-traditionalist agenda that's prevalent in the US in particular at the moment has continued to resist musical Eurocentricity, although often it draws on types of European art forms to validate its sort of status. And jazz history is frequently represented in African American exceptionalist terms. So although I understand the desire to create a critical discourse for evaluating jazz in its context and the need in many ways to separate jazz from the paradigms of classical music, the denial of European influence misunderstands the dynamics of cultural development and exchange. And these are the sorts of things I want to look at today. So, for example, when the new jazz studies scholar George Lewis promoted the idea of Eurological and Afrological theories in the mid-1990s, there was an inevitable loss of complexity and sensitivity to the intercultural dialogue that's existed through history. So the lack of engagement with jazz outside the US has been addressed through the writings of authors such as E. Taylor Atkins, who wrote a component called Jazz Planet, and Mike Heffley on his study of European jazz. However, more work clearly needs to be done to explore the complex relationship and exchanges that have taken place and shaped the development of jazz on both sides of the Atlantic. Okay, so in thinking about framing jazz in nationalist terms, I want to consider the way in which current jazz practice feeds into the core concepts of national identity. Writers such as Benedict Anderson and more recently Anthony Smith have discussed the way in which national identities emerge and are constantly constructed, fueling particular ideologies or mythic representations of different communities. Smith, for example, describes the types of activities that provide an essential building blocks of nationalism and national sentiment, ranging from the rise of the Eastern Bloc nationalism to many post-colonial nationalisms in Africa and Asia. Intellectuals representing the humanities, from historians to philosophers to poets to musicians, filmmakers and composers, tend to be disproportionately represented in a positive sense and within nationalist movements. Because I suppose that as cultural creators of cultural products and so on, they create symbols that can express, represent and reinforce certain types of boundary. But in certain contexts, artists, musicians can serve to define a nation and unite its members through a common imagery, shared meaning, myths and values. And definitions of nation and national identity are complex and difficult to pin down, and there are subtle differences between nations and ethnicities as well, which again are often conflated, especially when you're looking at music such as the jazz. So although Anderson describes the concept of nationalism as a type of imagined community, as represented in the title of his influential book, the power and influence of this way of thinking has served to shape the political and cultural paradigms of the international community for at least the last century. Nationalism, in effect, has developed into a type of surrogate religion that's accompanied by sacred beliefs and rituals and a commitment to some form of collective identity. So building on this, Smith argues that in order to thrive, a sense of national identity must feed into three underlying concepts: authenticity, continuity, and dignity. In practice, the balance between these concepts might vary according to national setting or the type of relation type of activities being framed in nationalist terms. And when considering these ideas in relation to jazz, I want to consider each concept in turn and think about ways in which they feed into broader musical discourse. So, authenticity. Nations should be free to express themselves, and so the only response to this is to promote a concept of authenticity. To be truly ourselves is to find authentic elements in our own being. The notion of authenticity, therefore, not only corresponds to the discovery of truth and the rejection of that which is fake, but also is bound up with the concept of originality. With this context, nationalism, origins, myths are all bound up with this context in some way, and they descent, they're all bound up with the idea of authenticity. Secondly, we could think about parody or playing of codes and conventions. Another way of examining transnational practice comes with this sort of challenging of stereotypes. Artists such as Django Bates, for example, have actively engaged with parody in music, playing with musical codes and conventions. Groups such as Loose Tubes, or more recently known groups like Human Chain and Delightful Precipice, created works that not only picked apart established repertoire. I'm thinking here an example like Hayes' New York, New York from 1995. It's sort of deconstructing established repertoire and so on, but also working in a transnational capacity. Bates himself set up Storm Chaser in Copenhagen and lived in Denmark for several years, and was quite interested in these kind of partnerships and collaborations too. And finally, this whole notion of genre, blurring the distinctions between high and low. And I want to maybe leave you with an example of this from a member of the project team, actually. I'm going to play you a piece by Trio VD, which is a new group on the scene. VD stands for Valentine's Day. I'm not saying that's disappointing. Although one festival said, catch VD at the festival. But they are a group that's on the scene at the minute that will actually be, one of the members of Saxopolis will be playing at the CMPCP conference in July. But again, this is an example of the type of music that deliberately blurs distinctions between high and low, or feeds into challenging the sort of notion of jazz as a particular genre category. The track I'm going to play you is a piece called Fill It Up from their album, it's called Return from the album Fill It Up Ghosts. And it features, as I said, the rhythm changes saxophonist Christophe de Bezenac. Now, although based in the UK, Christophe was born in Strasbourg. He's lived in a variety of different international locations, to the extent that he himself describes himself as a musician without a sense of home or national identity. And Trio VD are an interesting group in that they combine the sort of experimental saxophone techniques that you would have heard on albums like Brotzmann's Machine Gun, with a kind of pulsating minimalism and driving rhythmic patterns on the other hand. One BBC reviewer described it as notionally a jazz record. It owes just as much to the dynamics of rock, classical experimentalism, and take no prisoner's attitude of punk for most of its 40 minutes. So the result is a blurring of genre, where the music sounds experimental, but also appeals to audiences interested in a different type of music, or jazz as a kind of transnational practice. Yeah, so one of the group's early successes was their selection to appear at the 12 Points Festival, which again in itself is another example of the way in which jazz cultures are changing. 12 Points has developed into almost like a roving festival that in addition to its Dublin base, is delivered in a different location, European location, every other year. So in this respect, the festival celebrates the diversity of musicians across Europe and the mobility of artists, but also decentralises this concept of a festival being part of a unique place. So several jazz festivals recently, for example, have established partnerships with other festivals, or they've created satellite events in other countries, and so challenging this notion that cultural products are uniquely tied to a particular national scene or location. So I'll leave you with that, and then we can... Okay, so this piece is called Returns. Okay.